Legislators fiddle as the state budget burns, or is that too harsh? We'll talk about it next on Capitol View. Welcome to Capitol View, the program where we talk about state government, sometimes the federal government, and how it just might affect your life. I'm Bernie Schoenburg from the State Journal-Register. Special show today at a special time of year in Illinois as the legislature tries to wind down its work. With me today to talk about this, we've got so much experience in the room, it's just amazing. Charlie Wheeler is here, who is director of the Public Affairs Reporting Program, University of Illinois Springfield, longtime Chicago Sun-Times State House person before that. Charlie, welcome back.
Thank you, Bernie. It's always good to be here.
And a longtime colleague of both of ours, Mike Lawrence, is here. I believe it's your inaugural voyage on this show, but but Mike is, well, the resume would be too long, but he's recently retired director of the Paul Simon Public Policy Institute in Carbondale at SIU, and is a longtime reporter at the State House before that, and then was Jim Edgar's press secretary, but maintains, I think, somewhere in the middle of the road there on the political side. And Mike and I think were last on TV about 25 years ago when Channel 20 in Springfield had a show called Capitol Conference with Kelly Smith, and we were doing something like this. Now, public TV offers this service. Mike, welcome back.
Thank you. It was a couple of years ago.
And Mike has moved back to the Springfield area, right? So
that's correct.
Welcome back to Central Illinois.
Thank you.
Well, the state budget, and both of these gentlemen are pretty expert on the state budget, so the legislature is working to end the session. They were hoping by the 7th of May, which is very early in comparison to recent years. Not sure if that schedule is being met as we tape this show late in the week, but Charlie, where are things and how bad is it? And is there a solution?
Well, to give it in kind of broad terms, the state faces a $13 billion deficit going into the next fiscal year. That's the difference between what it would cost to provide the services to which we're now committed and the money that's likely to be there. The legislature has no appetite for raising taxes to begin to close this deficit. They don't seem inclined to cut spending to close the deficit. Plan to borrow money to kind of paper over a bit of it didn't go anywhere. It got shot down the other day.
At least in an initial vote.
Yeah, so it's like, I have no idea what they're going to do. I mean, maybe somebody's out there with the dowsing stick looking for that huge pillar of gold that's buried under the State House lawn. Nobody seems to have any practical solution that enough of these timorous legislators are willing to support to begin to make any headway. So we were talking before the show, Mike and I, between us, we've got I don't know, maybe 80 years of experience watching this stuff. We've never seen, or at least I've never seen, a situation where the state's fiscal condition is so dire and the willingness of the lawmakers to step up and address it in a responsible fashion is so disappointing.
Interesting. Well, Mike, obviously you've been around for a while. I think in the columns that you still do, and you are still, I guess I didn't mention that, a column every couple of weeks you still write, and it runs in papers, including the State Journal-Register, so there's something good in, oh no, yes. And Mike, what is the situation on, let's talk politically a little bit. Pat Quinn, the governor, he wanted a pretty big tax increase last year, income tax. This year he says 1%, calls it a surcharge for education. Harks back some to Jim Edgar, who made permanent and temporary income tax for education, if I get that right. Is that, and Bill Brady, his competition for governor on the Republican side, says we can do this without a tax increase. People are hurting, this is not the time. Your thoughts on why Quinn can't sell that with the Democratic legislature, and if Brady can be right about this?
Well, I think, for one thing, Governor Edgar had gone through a campaign in 1990 where the major issue was whether we're going to keep on an income tax surcharge or let it go off.
Right, and the Democrat Neil Hartigan wanted it to go off.
Right.
Right.
Governor Edgar won that election. The people of Illinois, I think, recognized that we needed to keep that tax on. And the fact that he won it probably emboldened legislators to go along with it. Governor Quinn really hasn't been through that kind of situation, and I don't think he has done the consistent, persistent sales job you need to do, both with the public and with legislators to bring that about. You just can't say you're for doing something and walk away from it. I mean, he's done some work in that regard, but in my opinion, not nearly the kind of work you really need to do.
What are we talking about exactly? Because we've discussed that here before. You know, at leadership, this month's Illinois Issues magazine talks about Illinois needs leaders. But how do you get that done? Does that mean you have to make deals and side deals like Lyndon Johnson did in Congress to get the Civil Rights Bill, and like perhaps Jim Thompson did to get, you know, tax increases through even with Republican members? How do you, what kind of work does it have to be, I'll give you this for that? Does it have to be that kind of thing? Or what can be done to set up that, the thing that Quinn has not seemed to have, which is the lever needed to get the tax increase that he wants?
Well, first of all, I'm critical of Governor Quinn, but in fairness to him, he's probably dealing with a different legislature than Edgar dealt with even in the 1990s. Back then, there were a lot of legislators who cared about nothing but getting reelected. But I think they could see ways where they could get reelected and cast some tough votes. There seems to be almost no appetite on the part of the current crop to do that kind of thing, or at least the majority of the current crop, although we ought to note that the Senate last year, the Senate Democrats did go on record for significant tax.
Yeah, that would have
increase.
taken individual income tax from 3% to 5%.
Yeah, it was a big jump. Now, to get to your question, I think you have to operate on two levels if you're the governor. One, you have to educate the public. And the people of Illinois really have no idea of the scale of this problem or the scope of it. And so there's an education job to be done. Internally, you know, legislators want various things. Some of them want to, you know, assurances that the governor will go in and campaign in their district, or in the case of a Republican with the Democrat governor, that the Democrat governor at least won't go in and campaign against him or her. Some of them want things in their district. And since the beginning of this country, that has been part of the process. These folks are representing their constituents, and they want things on their behalf. What makes this situation tough is that even if you do a substantial tax increase, it would be a mistake to dramatically increase spending. So you've got a condition, and it gets worse every year, where increasing taxes isn't going to be enough. You're going to have to put in place some curbs on spending, and you sure can't begin a whole bunch of new programs. It's harder to put legislative votes on under those conditions.
Well, you know, you say that voters aren't, and maybe I'll direct part of what you said to Charlie, but don't voters know from all these stories they see from people like us talking, and we know there's a vast audience for public television in Springfield, but there are stories everywhere about school districts laying off teachers, about social service agencies laying off people and not being able to serve as many people because state government isn't paying its bills, that the University of Illinois is like $450 million, at least at one recent point, in arrears from getting money from the state. So why doesn't that translate into people telling their legislators, do something about this? And I guess it might be because we've also got 10% or around 10% unemployment, and people are just hurting, as Bill Brady will say.
Yeah, but as I recall, back in the early 90s, you know, it wasn't a period of great economic nirvana here in this country either. Unemployment was high, people were out of work. but there seemed to be maybe a greater level of trust in the leaders, that when the leaders, someone like Jim Edgar says, this is what we have to do, and Edgar was a Republican working with a Democrat majority in the House with the current House Speaker, Mike Madigan, there was maybe a greater level of trust in the legislature and in the governor than has occurred in recent years. But the fact is, for whatever reason, public opinion survey after public opinion survey suggests that, no offense to the citizens of Illinois, but at least the ones who get asked these questions appear to be totally clueless. Because on the one hand they say, don't raise my taxes. And on the other hand they say, don't cut education, don't cut health care, don't cut human services, don't cut public safety. What else is there?
Yeah.
That's like 90% of the state's operating budget.
Yeah.
Is
Sure.
those areas.
I'm sorry.
No,
I think you've made a really good point that I should have made before you, and that is that historically in Illinois, when the income tax was enacted, you had a Republican governor. I believe every time it's been raised or maintained.
Yeah, Ogilvy started it. Thompson raised
you
it.
had a Republican governor.
Yep.
Edgar raised it.
Through most of that, you had a Democrat legislature, or at least one house of the legislature
Every time.
was Democrat. So part of the dynamics here and part of the political calculus here is that I think the Democrats are wary of voting. You know, when they control the legislature, they have a Democrat governor, there's no one to share the blame with. And I think that is one of their concerns. I mean, we've had three Democrat governors since Governor Ogilvy put that income tax in, and taxes haven't been raised under any of them, or at least not the
And interestingly,
general taxes.
Speaker Madigan, of course, the Democratic leader of the Democratic-dominated House, has said we need some Republican votes for this to pass. And Tom Cross, the Republican leader of the House, has not been willing, because that would give the Democrats the ability to say it was bipartisan, even if they get one vote.
Yeah, and to me, that's one of the big disappointments, that the two House leaders are more interested in playing politics than they are in trying to solve the problem. And as Mike suggested, because the Republican Party really has no skin in the game, they don't care. It's not their governor who's having to figure out how can we provide these core services at the same time that the revenues are off and the state is headed towards what in the private sector would be bankruptcy. So the temptation to say it's all the Democrats' fault. If the state implodes, the Democrats have been in charge, they're the ones you need to blame. Or if your taxes are raised, Democrats did it, they're the ones that need to blame. We Republicans didn't have any part of this, we didn't make the problem, we don't have to help solve it, you know, adios and good luck.
And the common denominator here with both parties is that they're putting their own political interests well above the public interest.
Well, I've listened to Bill Brady.
And here's the fact, I've mentioned this before, but it goes back to the roll calls in the past when it was bipartisan. If you look from 1969, when the income tax was enacted, through the increase under Jim Thompson, through the increase that was put in the end of Thompson's term that was an issue in the 90 election, through making that increase, there were 2 votes to make that increase permanent. And you look at the people who voted yes, and you look at the people who voted no, and then you look how they did the next time they ran for election. The people who voted no lost at a higher percentage than the people who voted yes. And you might think that's counterintuitive. Somebody who's against taxes, well, the people would love them. But because it was a bipartisan agreement, the people who were in shaky districts, the people who weren't
Who might have
as
lost
secure,
anyway.
who might have lost anyway, were the no votes. And the people who voted yes were people who could, for whatever reason, go home and tell their constituents, yeah, I know you don't like to pay taxes, but taxes is the price of having a civilized society.
Okay, well, speaking of the revenue picture, just to be a little more specific about what the legislature has been talking about. They're talking about $1 an increase in the tax on a pack of cigarettes, which latest incarnation I saw, it would be going for education. They're talking about possibly a tax amnesty that Governor Quinn at first kind of said he didn't like, but then indicated he was open to. We're talking about more borrowing that, at least on a test vote, did not go through the House. And we're talking about a sales tax holiday around late summer for clothing and school supplies, which would be like 8 days, which Quinn said is a great thing for people to go buy things and save some money and get some revenue generated in the stores. And Brady said is the populist Quinn just doing a gimmick again. Any thoughts about these ideas, and if they all make any sense?
Well, let's begin with the sales tax holiday.
Yeah.
That makes no sense to me. You're hurting on revenue. You've got this gargantuan deficit, and you're talking about going without revenues. Now, they may argue, oh, well, the increased business, that'll help, but if you don't have a sales tax on, it's not going to help. So
Won't help us.
yeah, I mean
businesses, but not the state.
that to me is just total pandering, political pandering. How they end up on putting together this sham for a budget, who knows? I mean, they may. If you look at the last several years, there may be some easy kind of taxes to approve, like cigarette taxes. Borrowing, if you look over the last several years, will be a big part of it. All of this is going to make the situation worse. Over the last several years, and Charlie's the expert on this, but it appears to me that they haven't even been treading this sea of red water. They've been making it worse by what they're doing. It's not like they're in a holding pattern, so when the economy comes back, that'll help us, get it together. They're making it worse. So that even if the economy does come back, even if it comes roaring back, which is unlikely over the next couple of years, there won't be enough money to handle this situation.
Which is an interesting point because, and again, I listen to the candidates, and Quinn talks about, things are looking up, unemployment is going down a little. But Brady continues to say we've lost over the last decade 700,000 jobs, I believe it is, from Illinois. Just get those jobs back and our budget will go up. Let's do that. But to me, that seems like not an immediate solution. Charlie?
Well, and I would argue that it's not a realistic solution based on history. And as a matter of fact, it was my friend Mr. Lawrence who did a column, went back in January perhaps, and said that if you accept this notion that economic development is what will save us, which is basically Brady's notion, we'll cut taxes and then there'll be more jobs and people will spend more and so on and so forth. And I believe, if I recall correctly, Mike looked at the highest growth rate for income taxes, the highest growth rate for sales taxes in the last, 25, 30 years, and said, even if we were to achieve these, in recent history, historic highs, it would barely make a dent in the problem. And
right.
So that's why this notion of, well, if we just grow the economy, that's not realistic either. That's like saying if we just eliminate all this waste and mismanagement.
Well, we'll see where it goes. It will be very interesting because...
Let me make another point. We talked about amnesty, we talked about cigarette tax increase. I think those things taken together would generate less than $1 billion. Well, just the other day, the Commission on Government Forecasting and Accountability came up with the revenue briefing through the end of April, which I happen to bring with me, and it says we have a tiny, tiny growth in revenues for the general funds in the first 10 months of the fiscal year. And the reason is we got roughly $1.5 billion from the federal government through the stimulus package. If you back that out, the state's revenues from income, sales, lottery,
all the big generators,
is actually down $1.2 billion in the first 10 months. And this budget was put together assuming a modest increase in those revenues. Income tax, individual income tax is off about $630 million. Corporate income tax is down about $300 million. Sales tax is down almost $500 million. So even if we enact all of these kind of peripheral plans that are going around, amnesty, cigarette tax and all that, it wouldn't even bring us back to even keel on the revenues.
And you know, in the early years of my reporting, which was kind of the middle years of your guys' reporting,
Yeah.
it was always a situation that every new budget was based on revenue growth. There was always $500,000 or $1 million or it got to be $1 billion a year, and of course the budget has ballooned in maybe the last 10 or 15 or 20 years from like 20 million a year to 50 million a year, 55 billion, I'm sorry. But that's the kind of thing that this big recession has put a halt to at this point.
Well, if you go back in Illinois history and look at the general funds, there was a steady pattern of growth. Every year, the general fund's revenues, stuff like income tax, sales tax, the main producers, was higher than the year before, going back to Eisenhower's years. Until 2002, in the wake of the terrorist attacks and the beginning of that recession in the early part of the century, when for the first time in, 40, 50 years, the money that came in a current year was less than what it was in the year before. Now that's almost commonplace, because this $1 billion plus shortfall for this year is on top of last year, which was less than the year before.
Let me throw a curveball, just that there's another candidate for governor on the ballot already, Rich Whitney. He's from Carbondale. He is the Green Party candidate. He's been for a big tax increase. Is there going to be any, I mean, he got 10% of the vote last time when Blagojevich was running for re-election against Judy Bartopinka. Mostly people thought because people were looking for an alternative. Is this a year for that, or is that just not going to happen in Illinois?
I don't see it happening. He may get 10% again. I think that was neither of the above vote. And I personally, I like Rich Whitney.
He's a smart guy.
I respect his forthrightness. Whether I agree with every bit of his economic plan, I respect the fact that at least he's put something out there, which calls for the kind of revenue increases.
Yeah, if you look at his numbers, they actually do add up.
Yeah.
His math is solid.
Well, he'll never get elected.
Yeah.
Well, but one of his big things is he wants to put a tax on transactions of like the Chicago Mercantile, those kinds
Which
of
is
financial
that was kind of an interesting new idea, something
Yeah.
new to tax, and
he
Illinois
points out-
is the center of the world in that kind of trading.
And he points out that the value of these transactions is in the trillions of dollars. And so if you took a tiny little fragment of a percent of a tax on top of them, you would generate $1 billion or more.
Yeah.
But the chance of that happening is probably equally to, having snow down in another region, so.
I don't know if it's just comic relief or not. That might not be nice, but Scott Lee Cohen, who won the Democratic nomination for lieutenant governor and then dropped out because he had some problems in his past, has announced he's running for governor, but as an independent candidate, you need 25,000 signatures, and I'm personally not sure he'll even get to that level to get on the ballot, because those signatures, whatever he turns in, will be scrutinized and maybe challenged at the State Board of Elections. So,
I think it's fair to say his odds are not great.
yeah, I think that's fair to say too. And I think the fact that he wants to get back in, I understand on a personal level why he'd want to do that, but given the publicity he's gotten, I'm not sure he's going to be a significant factor in this election.
Well, maybe he looks at it this way. It can't be any worse than it's been already, so all of his skeletons are out there, so why not?
As far as we know.
Well, if he gets back in the race, people will once again look at court files. Redistricting, since last I was at the program, has a redistricting plan or competing plans to change how Illinois does this have fallen by the wayside. So it looks like we've got the same old system in Illinois where the legislature will draw the map. If there's a deadlock, there will be actually a name drawn out of a hat to break the partisan, and one party will have advantage for drawing the map for the next 10 years for legislative districts. Predictable or unfortunate?
I think both. The Democrats have solid majorities in the legislature going into this election. I think they anticipate they'll have majorities afterwards. They weren't really in a mood to change. They did put their own plan out there, but close reading of that plan would show that it actually enhanced their chances of maintaining.
Senator Kwame Raoul was for it, and then he was very mad that even Governor Quinn indicated he didn't like that. He didn't think he wasn't sure it was real reform or something right before the vote in one of the houses of the legislature. So the Democrats' own governor was kind of not endorsing his own plan.
It did away with the lottery, the draw from the hat to break a stalemate. You could call that reform. But as I say, a close reading of it shows that it actually increased the Democrats' chances of holding their majority, which probably was not coincidental.
There was one.
I would add it, and I know Mike and I will disagree on this, but I looked at the map that the Republicans put forward and said, well, this will take it out of the hands of the legislature. I would say technically that's true, but it occurs to me that if you rely on a commission appointed by legislative leaders to draw the map,
they can get the same thing done.
I would say that's not totally independent, because you alluded to the tie-breaking mechanism. The tie-breaking mechanism under the Constitution has a Supreme Court put forward two people not of the same party, and then the name is drawn from the hat. There's nothing to preclude the Supreme Court from putting forward as the tiebreakers the most eminent cartographer at the University of Illinois and the most eminent cartographer at the University of Chicago or Northwestern or somewhere, and let these two guys who are basically geographers have the final say. But the court has always put forward people who were visibly partisan, former governors, one from each party, party chairman, one from each party, that sort of thing. So it was bound to be political at the end.
Okay, I should note there was an interesting legislative debate on vouchers, a system that would allow people, perhaps 30,000 students in Chicago, to get like $3,500 per family to go to private schools, but the unions didn't like it, and it was a very wrenching vote because a lot of black legislators and a lot of suburban Republicans liked it, but it did not pass a test vote in the House, so it looks like it's not happening this year. On that note, we're going to have to watch what happens, perhaps come back again, but to Charlie Wheeler and to Mike Lawrence, after your long absence from Springfield TV, welcome back.
Thank you.
I'm Bernie Schoenburg. Thank you for watching Capitol View, and we'll see you next time.